Hi, everybody. My name is Claudia de Luna. I am well aware that I am at least one of the things standing between you and the festivities this evening, and particularly beer. So let's get on with it. I have probably the worst named presentation here. And that's because there were a lot of messages that I wanted to try and convey. I've been on this particular road of automation, which means not Perl, since 2015. And over the last 18 months, really started to make some progress. I've done some presentations talking about, get started, just start, here's how to push config. And for the first time, I'm actually able to put a lot of that together in process. And I'm so happy that in the conference, we're starting to hear that theme over and over again. In fact, the good news and the bad news is everything I'm going to tell you, you've actually heard before. That's actually good because independently of each other, kind of on parallel paths, a lot of us have actually come to a lot of the same conclusions. And I think that's going to start to be a big win, maybe get some momentum building. So we've always done it this way. It just doesn't serve your business any longer, right? But how do we get out of we've always done it this way? With the tooling that's available, the new skills that, like it or not, a lot of us are learning, there are options. So I'm going to show you kind of how I tried to put that together in my version of the little round workflow, because every one of us, almost every one of us has had that. The other theme that I've learned is manual entry is evil, and you have heard that here many, many times. So do whatever you can to minimize that. And there's a repository I'll share with you that kind of has little bits of automation, kind of every phase of the process. But before we do that, I want to share with you some observations that have helped me. So I was part of one of the first partner sessions that Cisco gave when ACI was introduced. And ACI basically made my head explode. Love it or hate it, it taught me to think about things a little bit differently. It was my first exposure to software-defined networking, however you want to define it. And I know it's maybe evil now, but I still have ACI, and I got some, I think, really good perspectives from it. First of all, it made me ask, why do I care about these things? Because one of the first things you figure out in ACI is VLAN really doesn't have a meaning. Spin one up, tear it down, doesn't matter. It has a meaning when you leave the fabric. But within the fabric, it's completely automated. I don't get to pick the internal fabric VLANs. And I thought, wow, how can I live in that world? I don't care about the number. Why do I care about the number? And so that got me thinking, question a lot of these things, question all the things that I'm comfortable with. Isn't it great to be in a world where I don't really care what the IP address is, I can still apply policy? Great, that's the world I want to live in. I don't want to configure 75 boxes, right? Even with automation, I don't want to configure 75 boxes. The other big takeaway I took from ACI was 5 things. I needed 5 bits of data, and I had a VXLAN fabric. I want to do that everywhere else in my work, because that's pretty huge. And so those 2 things have always stayed with me. Again, whether you like or don't like ACI, I thought that those perspectives were pretty useful. The other perspective comes from the Lunar Landing Program. I'm a big fan of space. And so I started thinking from AutoCon 0, how do we measure progress? Is there a way to measure progress? And I coincidentally was reading yet another NASA book. And I thought, wow, these guys, there's something to learn from these programs, okay? Because they kind of chunked it up the way it's turning out, at least I'm chunking things up. So we started with the Mercury program. Can we, actually escape gravity? Can we orbit the Earth? Can a human actually function? Can we get home? And then the realization in that Mercury program that, we've been given this mandate to go to the moon, but there's like a big chunk missing, and we're not quite sure what that is. And so the Gemini program came to be, and it was actually called Bridge to the Moon, because it's like, guys, we've got to figure out some other stuff first before we can actually get there. And so the Gemini program was, can we launch multiple people? Can we orbit, rendezvous, dock, right? Can we change our orbit? Can we actually exit the vehicle and function? And then, of course, Apollo came into being. And my favorite story with Apollo is, great, we figured out we can do all this stuff. How are we going to get there? Is it going to be a ship? One big ship that lands, travels, lands, lifts off, comes back? Well, that's not how it turned out. But those are the kinds of questions that they had to ask and answer. And they're not that dissimilar from our own kind of struggles with how to automate for ourselves. So I kind of always think about what's my mission objective for this particular thing I'm trying to do. Okay, so I picked a really mundane example of something that is supremely boring that we all do every day, all the time, right? I need to extend an existing VLAN. So before we walk through the workflow, though, I do want to mention one final kind of observation, is that every time I ask a network, and I'm a network engineer, by the way, every time I ask a network engineer, hey, we have got to deploy 802.1x at this site, got 75 switches. How long is it going to take? 30 seconds. It's going to take you 30 seconds to deploy 802.1x configuration on 70 devices? Sure. 30 seconds per device. 30 seconds per device. And we start decomposing all the steps that actually need to happen. So it's actually not 30 seconds, right? It's, here's the configuration I have to develop for every switch. I have to go to change control, right? I have to present my body of work. Maybe I have to present not just the configuration, but the verification steps I'm going to undertake. Maybe also the rollback. Maybe the justification. Maybe I have to lay out my workflow. Maybe I have to tell them, hey, here's the risk of doing this. And eventually I browbeat them into admitting either you really underestimated how long it's going to take you, or you're skipping a lot of really important steps in the process if it's going to take you 30 seconds. And that's something that's also always kind of stuck with me whenever asked, because right now I'm in the consultant role, right? So spend a lot of time working with clients, understanding what they want to do and understanding where automation can play a role. And so I've automated maybe things that we haven't talked about yet here in this community. So this is my circle diagram, okay? It's a typical well-known workflow. In our case, it's going to be extending an existing VLAN. There's time across all of this, right? Because eventually, if you start, you have a design somewhere. There's a version of the slide that has like source of truth, probably in almost every bubble. And then there's the initial deployment, which is T0. And then you go through this whole process. And I've been able to automate pretty much everything for particular tasks, for specific tasks across this little wheel. So let's take a look at that. So I put together a little demonstration. Oops. Give me one sec. Okay, good. So we're going to blaze through these. This is just a little app I threw together for this to try and show you kind of how this is going to work. So there's a number of well-known things here. Extending an existing VLAN, adding a new VLAN, adding a new port channel, stuff we do every day. Probably you've already figured out that I'm spending a lot of time these days, actually not in the data center, but in more of a campus enterprise environment. So in terms of minimizing what I'm asking for, there's very little typing in this. It's what location needs a VLAN, what type of VLAN does it need. In this case, I selected the IoT VLAN. That let me pull out at that location what IoT VLANs were available. And I'm picking 901. And I'm showing a lot of the output as you see here. And then one of the things you'll see here is which switch do I need to apply it to? And then a bunch of files will pop up. So in this process, I've created the update configuration, what I need to push. the rollback configuration, a change document, a nicely, well, for me anyway, a nicely formatted little document that talks about here's what I'm going to do, here's the risk, here's how I test it, here's how I roll it back. And that's really suitable for maybe like putting into a ticket. For this particular client, we didn't have access to, let me pause this for a sec. We didn't have access to ServiceNow. And for us, that's always a challenge, right? Sure, do I want to automate the whole thing? Could I push to ServiceNow? Absolutely. Only if I have access to it. So in this case, it was very much put together, automate putting together the documentation, and then we have one of our project coordinators load it up. So this is, like I said, just a very simple document that kind of incorporates everything. It generated the config, the test, the verification, the rollback, some stuff about risk. These are the commands to add, just the commands to remove, and then ultimately here's some testing that I did. And so one of the things that I did here is I went and I pulled the configuration of the switch that was selected. I had to kind of purpose it to pull out the things that I care about, and eventually turned it into a Container Lab config. I spun up Container Lab. I also figured out what the upstream switch was. I essentially spun up Container Lab, pushed those two configs, applied the commands you saw, and made sure I got root, or at least trunking was set up. And then I also created this YAML file, which has everything I figured out. And we'll see where that comes into play in a moment. So that's taken me through the change details, right? VLAN 901 and IoT VLAN. Notice the user actually didn't have to put anything, and that is right now a huge goal of ours. Every time we have somebody type in, I just have to spend a lot of time kind of validating whatever gets put in. Although I've heard some good tips today for how to fix that, or how to do better at that. Again, assume anything that's typed in is wrong, because anything that's typed in is potentially configuration drift, and exceptions really do kill automation. Put together a configuration payload. Super simple, Jinja. Should we have been doing this all along? Yes. How many are actually doing that right now? I'm just curious. Who has all of their configuration templates and revision control and are smart templates, Jinja-based templates with some logic? Okay, good. It's a great place to start, right? I started up there. It's two variables, VLAN and name. Getting that name standard was tricky. So one of the things I did, and we'll get to that in a moment, is I figured out a way to never have to ask kind of how to name it. I then evolved to this, which is the VLAN, and then there's some logic here about, well, if it's a port channel, use that. If it's a trunk, then use that. And then this is that report. So this is the report that we would put up into ServiceNow. And I also can output the specific commands that I'm ultimately going to send to the device. So that whole process that only took a few seconds, right, has given me all the data to do a lot of these things. So I always save the payload. Even if I'm not sure what to do with it or what I'm going to do with it, I save it. I'm not going to say more about configuration templates, right? Get them under revision control. Make them smart, Jinja-based or any other templating language. They're so useful in terms of when you added a feature. They really do at least make my life easier. I spend a lot of time with refreshes, so I'm doing a lot of configurations. So that's an important point too, right? If you don't do a lot of configurations, maybe that's not a good place for you to start. It was for me. This one is something that we really struggled with, and I'm so happy that InfraHub was finally released, not finally, but that it was released, because I really think it's gonna play a big part in this encoding our guidelines. So I need to go somewhere, okay, the guidelines can't be in a Word document that tell me I need to name every VLAN, and that I should put the IP address in every VLAN. Well, I'm gonna do it this way, and someone else is gonna do it that way, and third person's gonna do it that way, right? So we need a way to programmatically get those guidelines. And standards too. All of my IoT VLANs should be in the 900 range. And that actually gets me to a point where, okay, they just need to be in the 900 range, so I'm just gonna pick the next 900, right? Do I care that it's 901 or 902? One of the things we do a lot is we try, because documentation is always a problem for network engineers, so we try to encode the things we need to troubleshoot in the network itself, which is great, but then when it's not exactly that way, it leads to trouble. And so back to my ACI analogy, right? Why do I care that it's 901, right? And so I'm always asking myself that. I also live in the real world. I get why that's oftentimes important. But encoding the guidelines, at least in the little demo, so I associated a template with it. I actually said IoTs in the 900 range. Here's what it is. Here's who uses it, room occupancy and temperature sensors. I have a short name. I use that short name to build the name. I never ask anybody to to name a VLAN, right? That basically comes from running this little tool. Okay, impact. Every ticketing system that I'm aware of, or at least that I have worked with, actually asks you, what is the impact of this change you're proposing? Well, this is a well-known change, and there should be a well-known impact, right? And really the only difference in this little kind of YAML table that I put together is what's the function of the device, because it's slightly different impact if it's a layer 3 device or a layer 2 device. And so you can see here that it's probably difficult to read, but I actually have a database, which is a YAML file, of well-known actions. This is existing VLAN, and I have a description. It lays out all the steps I need to take. It has the device type I should be acting on. It has the impact description. I'm just pulling that little report that we saw earlier, just pulls the impact description from here. Again, that's enough to do tickets, right? And a lot of this you hear me talk about is just getting ready for change management in some form or fashion, even a well-known change. Maybe it is a standard ticket, but you still have to do a lot of this paperwork, right? And so with automation, we kind of knock that out. And we also made some progress in terms of how we were going to push the data. But at this point, we're actually ready to go to change management, maybe not approve it, but we're ready to like get a change management ticket. Okay, so the next step, before I actually can get approved, I need to make sure that the network is in the state I think it is. I'm hearing a lot, this is very much a chicken and egg thing going on right now with all of the presentations that we've had, and the, my network is my source of truth, some other system is my source of truth. I think there's going to be push and pull there constantly. And for me anyway, at least with the clients that I'm supporting, I got to check. Yes, maybe it's in some system. Usually it's in a Visio. I got to check no matter what. So in the little sampler app you just saw, what I do is using SUSE-Q on the back end, I pull the configuration, I munge it for Container Lab, I spin up a little lab, and I push my configuration. And I also use SUSE-Q to verify that the network is in the state I think it is. At this point, I've done my Container Lab, I've spun it up, it's got the upstream switch, the switch that I need to get the VLAN to, it's passed all my checks. I left a lot of the kind of the raw data, because I don't know what you guys like to see best. In real world versions of this, we don't do that. We just cut to the chase. It's green, go. We actually do thumbs up or thumbs down. One of my teammates is green, red colorblind, right? So green and red, bad. So we make sure everything passed. We essentially test everything, and now we're ready for operational deployment. My change gets approved, especially since I took the trouble of testing, which is something that falls by the wayside a lot. Where's Rick? So anyway, I'm approved. I am ready to go. Now what? Okay. We're going to blaze through this one. So at this point, that YAML file that you saw, that you're probably wondering, what am I doing with it? I just dragged it into here. It pulled out the payload. Right now, it's not letting me proceed till I put a ticket. I put a ticket in. I did the dry run, so that's just showing me what's going to get pushed to both switches, the upstream and the switch I selected. Now I'm going to execute, and it's going to go through, and it's, again, being very verbose. Normally, I don't display all of this. I display the, we're good. And it's going through, and we're essentially saving the test results, also something that I can attach to the ticket. And it essentially saves the logs of everything. So not only every command that got input, but also every show command, every verification command is all basically in a new file waiting to attach the ticket. We can close it out. So 1 through 5 got me an approved change. 6 through 8 executed and essentially let me wrap up. If you looked at the original diagram, the execute bubble is like the smallest one of the whole cycle. And that's actually true. And even though it's ironic that that's kind of where we all started, right? Can I push config? It winds up being, I'm not going to say trivial, but there's so much more involved. I'll say that. Okay. So we've deployed it. What I showed you here, well, I spent a lot of the last few years kind of in the Mercury stage of automation, which is we generated the config and engineers copied and pasted it. Now we're moving into the Gemini phase, right, where we've done things like this. We've done a lot of checks. We've actually pushed it out. I consider Apollo, and this is just kind of my view of things, sort of the DevOps world, right? So what I'm showing you here is sort of Gemini type of automation. But let's face it, we've been in Gemini type space program for the last 50 years, right? We've just been orbiting the Earth. I mean, maybe some probes have gone out to other planets, but we just started trying to get back to the moon, and we'll see how successful we're going to be. So anyway, executing the change. The most interesting thing about executing the change for me is what triggers it. So I call this manual orchestration, or, which is kind of an oxymoron, right? You have to think about how you want to kick that off, and that actually may help you make some decisions about what tooling you need. But understanding how you want to trigger it, and right now, for us, for most of my clients, they're not ready for Apollo. They're not ready for the DevOps orchestrator kind of thing, commit, execute. So everyone wants to see what's going on, kind of an automated, step-by-step process. But that's okay, because we're a lot further along than we used to be. The tricky thing about the Apollo level, what I'm calling the DevOps, is that those concepts and that tooling are very unfamiliar to network engineers. And so I think we're going to have it's a difficult thing, right? Most network engineers don't know anything about revision control. It's it's going to be a bit of a challenge, and I think that's one of the reasons why we have this conference, to figure out how we're going to overcome that, but also to figure out who needs Apollo-level automation. Okay, the other thing that happened in that very quick video is that I ran all those same tests that I ran on the virtual lab, on the production lab. So I'm reusing a lot of the code, right? And essentially, I got a little report that says that change request is done, it's documented, it took 8 seconds. Obviously, this is lab, and this is essentially one device. But I also like to think about what else should I be doing? So one of the things we're doing for a project right now where we're deploying a lot of new VLANs, which is why you have this example. So we're standing up new VLANs, moving a lot of devices into it. And one of the problems we've had is that scopes weren't set up. And a lot of these devices need DHCP. And so we would get to these migrations, and the scopes, things wouldn't be getting IP addresses. Well, the scopes weren't set up. So as part of our testing now, what we do is we spin up an SVI. We say, give me an IP via DHCP. And that's part of our test suite now. So we're trying to see how can we test a level in to the applications. Not necessarily to the applications, right? But maybe to the next level of network services. Okay, closeout activities become trivial. Pick the report you want to attach to something, mail it to someone, you're done, right? If you don't like the text of the report, change the didnt template. So, again, like I mentioned, the execute change winds up being kind of the smallest bubble. All told, right? The first part took a little over a minute, and then the second part took 8 seconds. Again, for one, your mileage may vary, and obviously this is an example to prove, well, to illustrate a point. But the nice thing about that is now the network engineer actually has a chance of being right. It is going to take 30 seconds. And no steps will be skipped, which is huge. And I don't think we spend enough time understanding how many steps we skip. For example, the SVI test that I mentioned, we used to do it manually. Let's say we have a site with 75 switches. Let's say 50 of them are getting this new VLAN. We would do the DHCP test on one switch because we were doing it manually, right? Well, now with the new testing capabilities, we do it on every switch that got that VLAN. And we've actually saved ourselves some grief by not migrating stuff, right? Or we fixed stuff before the migration occurred. And it's hard to quantify that. I'm hoping maybe you guys can give me some ideas on how to do that. How do you quantify things you didn't do? So in terms of the little sampler app, right, we determined and documented the necessary details. We developed the payload configuration in a variety of formats, right, that we could kind of reuse in different ways, including pushing the configuration. We spun up a lab, we pushed those configurations, we made sure it all worked the way we expected it to. We got an approved ticket. We pushed it out in the production environment, ran all of our QA, reused a lot of that QA, and essentially closed things out. Closing out could be just closing out the ticket, could be sending an email to the customer, and we have all the data to kind of craft it in whatever way is best consumable by the client, by the ticketing people. So what was involved in all of that, and this is another theme that keeps cropping up, especially today, right, is the ecosystem is pretty big, and I'm just listing things here that I have personal experience with. There's much, much more that could be put on here. And in fact, that data store should actually now read OpsMill. But for change details, I use SUSIQ. I use Jinja for payload. I kind of dummied up a couple of standard YAML files for quantifying impact, understanding the type of VLANs that were out there. ServiceNow is right now kind of the most popular that I've worked with anyway. ITSM platform. For state analysis, SUSIQ and Batfish, which had some great examples of how that works. The lab infrastructure, I'm a big fan of container labs if you hadn't noticed. Executing changes, Ansible, NetMiko, Nornir, APIs, all available. In the little app, I use NetMiko. Testing QA, also SuzyQ. Close activities, ServiceNow, obviously everything is in a GitHub repo. It's all Python-based. And then the most important thing, I am not a front-end person either. I leverage Streamlit and Solera all the time because they allow me to spin up a little app like that with easy pull-downs super quickly, and I don't really have to know anything about web design. Was it pretty? No, it was not. Does it get the job done? It does. Most of the little apps and kind of process automations that we've done, we now no longer roll out in Python scripts. We roll out with a Solera or a Streamlit front end. Anything else I didn't mention? Python, Jinja, YAML, SuzyQ, open source. There was some functionality testing that I had to do, that I actually had to parse, because with open source SuzyQ, like I can't test for spanning tree. With enterprise, you can. So I had to do some extra coding for that. Container Lab, like I said, I used manual orchestration, which means I push the button. And then a GitHub repository, used Cisco ConfParse. When I pulled out the configuration from SuzyQ, I had to pull out just the bits that I cared about to kind of spin up a lab. So what didn't this include? A lot, actually, right? I completely skipped past being able to push to the ITSM, the ticketing system. That's certainly doable if you have access to it. The guidelines, right? That shouldn't be in a YAML system. Again, I was just trying to mock things up. I'm actually looking forward to playing with InfraHub to see if it'll solve that problem. So an IPAM solution for subnets. Notice that the subnet had to have the IP encoded into it. The reason I kind of cheated and I went with an existing VLAN is because it was going to take too long to walk through how I was going to put together that name without an IPAM kind of back end to verify. Because again, if I ask someone to type it in, it's going to be wrong. It doesn't have workflow orchestration. It didn't have enterprise level observability that would give me things like spanning tree. And of course, I was running this on my laptop and some hosted servers. So back to the lunar landing program. I started putting together kind of how I would rate one of my customers in this lunar kind of set of levels, right? Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo, and trying to put some characteristics around it. This is just Claudia's crazy idea, but I think we need something like this, right? To try and kind of figure out where we are, what are the characteristics we should be focusing on, again, to help maybe self-select down some tools. I think the little app is arguably somewhere in here. Okay, if Apollo level automation and orchestration is what you're talking about, then this is what it would look like. This is Prefect, right? Kind of the same kind of thing, just using another workflow orchestration. Rest assured, I will be using workflow orchestration. I'll be testing and playing around with workflow orchestration because I was here for the labs earlier this week. But this is really nice, right? Every task gets a status. I get dependency diagrams of what needs to happen when. Good stuff. Takes a lot of work. Very much not what network engineers are kind of used to, from my experience. Okay, so what are your mission objectives? Pick a project. You've got ample examples from here about where to start, right? A template, NTP, SNMP strings, normalizing all your VLAN names, making sure your VLANs have names, right? Lots of little things that you can do. Understand how do you want to trigger those workflows? And then, like I said, with automation, maybe the network engineer was right, and it will be 30 seconds instead of days or weeks. And then think about what else you can automate. Service level testing, those SVI tests I talk about. I wish, again, I could quantify how many hours those have saved us. I just know that they have. And there is a link, and just remember, we all started, this college student sitting in an arroyo in Pasadena. Sorry, that's kind of where I started working. But all the way through, you have to figure out kind of where you want to be. And we haven't been there for 50 years, really. Link to, I think the slides will be made available. That's the link to the repository. Thank you very much.
We got time.
3 minutes, you guys.
Hey, thanks. Great presentation. Do you find that the current change management standards are a big thing that are holding back automation? For example, with normal changes, you need to get to human approvers. And often I argue that automation and what you've just shown there should be one of those approvers. Is that something you come across?
Very much so. And we're spending a lot of time trying to move into the standard change arena, right? I will document the heck out of the change. Just with this level of risk on this type of device, just let us do it. There's a little app I did. I did a series on Suzy Q with 2 parts, and the second part was all about using a REST API. It's called Dial a VLAN. That's actually from a pitch we're doing to a client who literally just is inundated with port flips all day long. I watch them come in ServiceNow, and they're not a standard change. And I'm like, no. And so a year ago, I said, listen, under what conditions would you allow maybe specific users, local network engineers at a particular location, would you give them access to just letting them do their own port flips? And we laid out, it's got to be spanning tree, it's got to be on the switch. There's a few other conditions that they wanted. It needs to be this type of VLAN, or this type of the services of that VLAN. Things like, are there other devices on that VLAN that are similar to what I'm trying to move? And we're running, luckily, we've got Enterprise Suzy Q on that, so I can answer all those questions. And so that little demo that I put together is actually a much simpler version of what we're pitching to the client to solve that. But yes, it is definitely an impediment, and over the last 6 months, I spent a lot of time trying to convince ITSM people, right, that this is a safe thing to do. We've done it successfully 150 times because we automate everything. I mean, I'll be honest with you, we were able to do it successfully 150 times, and that was with copy-paste, right? Because all the guys know, I catch them typing, it's not going to be pretty.
Last one. Okay.
Okay, so thank you for your presentation. It was star level, pun intended. What I want to ask is it easier, do you find it easier to fill up your crew on the Gemini stage than towards the Apollo stage?
I haven't been able to sell anybody on the Apollo stage yet, and I've got some good ideas. So the other theme that we've seen here is it's services, not scripts. And we really need to start changing kind of the context and how we pitch this stuff. I've been lucky, and I think I missed this because I'm not pitching automation per se. We get called in, like, hey, can you refresh these 100 sites? And then my boss comes and says, okay, we got to refresh these 100 sites. How are we going to do that really fast, really accurately? We don't want to spend all day for day one support figuring out why cables got put into the wrong ports and have the wrong configuration. User problems, right? We don't want to spend all day fixing user problems. And so my job is to automate kind of under the hood. So we're never actually selling the automation. We're selling, guys, since we automated day one support, the guys just sit around, drink coffee. Because, we know during the deployment, if we plugged in a cable in the wrong, and this happens all the time. But we do pre and post QAs, as you've heard a lot of people do that, and it's like, hey, you guys are off by a port. Can you back it all up? You know, because once they go off by a port, it's usually all of them off by a port. I see people nodding, so I'm not alone here. So we're trying to reframe kind of how we're pitching that conversation. And I've gotten some great ideas here, so thank you. Thanks for the question, Johannes.
Thank you for rounding out the day.